The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath a blazing sun on that fateful morning of October 26, 1942. Aboard the USS Hornet, the air was thick with tension, salt spray, and the acrid smell of aviation fuel. The aircraft carrier cut through the cobalt waters east of the Santa Cruz Islands, her crew of nearly 3,000 men moving with the practiced precision of warriors who knew that death could arrive at any moment from the sky above. Lieutenant Commander James Fletcher stood on the bridge, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he surveyed the horizon. The wind whipped against his face, carrying with it the weight of responsibility that every officer aboard felt. They were part of Task Force 16, supporting operations in the Solomon Islands campaign, and intelligence reports had been clear. Japanese forces were searching for them with deadly intent. Before we continue with this incredible story of courage and split-second decisions that changed the course of naval warfare, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring these remarkable historical accounts to life. The morning had started like any other combat patrol day. Sailors moved across the flight deck, securing aircraft, checking equipment, running through their routines with the muscle memory born of endless drills. But beneath that routine lay an electric current of anticipation. Everyone knew they were in contested waters. Everyone understood that contact with the enemy wasn't a question of if, but when. Ensign Robert McCarthy, barely 23 years old, sat in the ready room with his squadron mates. The young pilot from Iowa had joined the Navy 2 years earlier, driven by a fierce patriotism after Pearl Harbor. Now, dressed in his flight suit, he reviewed his mission notes for what felt like the 100th time. Around him, other pilots did the same, some joking to ease the tension, others sitting in contemplative silence. "Think we'll see action today?" asked Ensign Thomas Miller, a stocky kid from Texas who'd grown up on stories of aerial combat. McCarthy glanced up, meeting his friend's eyes. "With our luck, count on it." The words had barely left his mouth when the ship's alarm system erupted into life. The piercing wail of the general quarters klaxon sent every man into immediate action. Feet pounded against metal decks as sailors rushed to their battle stations. The intercom crackled with urgency. All hands, all hands. Large formation of enemy aircraft bearing 270, distance 60 miles and closing. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill." On the bridge, Captain Charles Mason felt his pulse quicken, though his face remained impassive. The 52-year-old naval veteran had commanded the Hornet through some of the war's most crucial moments, including the Doolittle raid. He'd seen combat, understood its chaos, but what the radar was showing him now made his blood run cold. "Sir, we're tracking at least 60-plus contacts," reported Lieutenant Harris from the radar station. The young officer's voice was steady, but his knuckles were white as he gripped his console. "They're coming in fast and low. Configuration suggests they're Nakajima B-5N bombers." The Kate bombers. Every American sailor in the Pacific knew about the Kates. These torpedo bombers had earned their deadly reputation at Pearl Harbor and in subsequent engagements. Slow by fighter standards but carrying devastating payloads, they attacked in coordinated waves that could overwhelm a ship's defenses. Mason's mind raced through the tactical situation. His fighter cover was already stretched thin, having launched earlier to intercept another formation. The Hornet was vulnerable and she wasn't alone. The entire task force was at risk. He turned to his executive officer, Commander William Harrison. "Get all available fighters in the air now. Every plane that can fly, I want it up there." Harrison nodded sharply and grabbed the communications handset. Throughout the ship, the order transmitted with crystal clarity. In the hangar deck, aviation crews worked with frantic efficiency, rolling out aircraft, performing last-minute checks, fueling planes that had just landed. McCarthy and his squadron were already racing toward their fighters. The flight deck had transformed into controlled chaos, a deadly ballet of men and machines moving in perfect synchronization despite the urgency. Plane handlers guided aircraft into position, while others stood ready with fire extinguishers, their eyes constantly scanning for any sign of trouble. The young ensign climbed into his F-4F Wildcat, his hands moving through the pre-flight checklist with automatic precision. Around him, other fighters were already starting their engines, the roar building to a deafening crescendo. Through his canopy, he could see the deck crew giving signals, their movements sharp and decisive. "Wildcat flight. This is Hornet Tower," the radio crackled in McCarthy's headset. "You are cleared for immediate launch. Vector 270 to intercept incoming strike force. Estimate 20 plus Kate bombers with fighter escort. Good hunting." McCarthy's heart hammered as he pushed the throttle forward. The Wildcat surged ahead, gaining speed as it raced down the deck. The edge approached rapidly, and then he was airborne, the sudden transition from solid deck to open sky always a moment of pure adrenaline. He banked hard, climbing as his wingmen formed up around him. From his vantage point above the task force, the scene was both beautiful and terrifying. The American ships cut white wakes through the blue Pacific, their anti-aircraft guns already tracking skyward. Destroyers had moved into screening positions, their crews at battle stations. And there, on the horizon, he could see them, a dark swarm of aircraft approaching like a plague of locusts. Back on the Hornet, Captain Mason stood at the center of the bridge, surrounded by his officers. Every man knew their role, understood what was at stake. The carrier was the heart of the task force, and if she went down, the entire operation could collapse. "Sir, our fighters are engaging the enemy outer screen," reported Lieutenant Harris. "They're taking down some of the escorts, but the Kate bombers are breaking through." Mason clenched his jaw. The mathematics of aerial combat were brutally simple. His fighters could only do so much against a determined attack of this size. The bombers would get through, and when they did, it would come down to the ship's defenses and the skill of her crew. "All gun crews, weapons free," he ordered. "Target the bombers. Make every shot count." Throughout the ship, gunners prepared their weapons. The 5-inch guns, the 40mm Bofors, the 20mm Oerlikons, every piece of anti-aircraft weaponry the Hornet possessed would be needed. Petty Officer Daniel Chen, a gunner from San Francisco's Chinatown, checked his 40mm mount one last time. The young sailor had joined the Navy to prove himself, to show that his loyalty to America was absolute despite the prejudice he faced at home. Now, with enemy bombers inbound, such concerns seemed distant and petty. "Here they come," someone shouted. The Kate bombers emerged from the morning glare, their profiles unmistakable even at distance. They flew in tight formation, disciplined and determined. These were veteran pilots, men who had trained for years and fought through countless engagements. They knew their business, and they knew the Hornet was a prize target. McCarthy dove on the formation from above, his guns blazing. Tracers arced through the sky as his bullets found their mark, tearing into the fuselage of a Kate. The bomber shuddered, trailing smoke, but maintained its course. He pulled up hard, avoiding collision, and repositioned for another pass. "They're not breaking!" Miller's voice came over the radio, tinged with disbelief. "They're holding formation straight for the carrier." It was true. Despite the fighter attacks, despite taking casualties, the Japanese bombers maintained their deadly precision. This was the discipline that made them so dangerous, the willingness to fly into hell itself to complete their mission. On the Hornet, the anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. The sky erupted with flak bursts, creating a steel curtain between the ship and the attacking bombers. The sound was thunderous, a continuous roar that made verbal communication nearly impossible. Sailors communicated through hand signals and raw instinct, loading shells and tracking targets with mechanical efficiency. Chen's 40mm gun hammered away, the weapon bucking against its mount as he walked his fire across a Kate bomber. He could see pieces flying off the aircraft, could see the rear gunner slumped in his position, but still the bomber came on. The dedication of these enemy pilots was both admirable and terrifying. A Kate exploded midair, hit by a 5-inch shell that found its bomb bay. The blast was spectacular, an orange fireball that briefly outshone the sun. Debris rained down into the ocean, but the formation didn't waver. More bombers pushed through, their pilots focused with singular intensity on their target. Captain Mason watched the attack develop with the eye of a seasoned commander. He could see the bombers' approach vectors, could calculate where they would release their torpedoes. The Hornet was already taking evasive action, her helmsman spinning the wheel to throw off the attacker's aim, but a ship of her size couldn't turn on a dime. "Torpedoes in the water!" the lookout screamed. "Multiple torpedoes bearing 285. The long, deadly fish streaked through the water toward the carrier, their wakes clearly visible. On the bridge, every man held his breath. These were the moments when training and luck intersected, when the difference between survival and destruction came down to yards and seconds. The Hornet shuddered as she turned hard to starboard, her massive bulk protesting the violent maneuver. One torpedo passed harmlessly down her port side, missing by mere feet. Another ran too deep, passing beneath her keel. But a third struck home, the explosion sending a geyser of water skyward and causing the entire ship to shudder. "Damage report," Mason barked. Below decks, damage control teams were already in motion. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, the ship's damage control officer, coordinated the response with practiced calm despite the chaos surrounding him. Water was flooding into compartments near the hit, and the ship was taking on a list, but the Hornet was tough, built to absorb punishment. "Flooding in frame 78 to 82, Webb reported over the intercom. "Damage control parties are containing it. We've lost some forward speed, but main propulsion is still operational." Mason nodded, filing away the information. The ship was hurt, but still fighting. That was all that mattered. Above, the air battle continued with savage intensity. McCarthy and his squadron mates were in the fight of their lives, engaging the enemy bombers at close range despite the risk of friendly fire from the ships below. The young pilot from Iowa had already expended most of his ammunition, but he continued to press his attacks, using his fighter to harass and distract the bombers. Another Kate fell from the sky, trailing fire and smoke, then another. The American fighters and the ship's anti-aircraft fire were taking a terrible toll on the attacking force, but still they came. The Japanese pilots displayed a courage that transcended nationality or politics. This was pure warrior spirit, men committed to their mission regardless of cost. Ensign Miller's voice cut through the radio chatter, urgent and strained. "I've got 3 Kates, breaking from the main formation, coming in low on the starboard side." Mason had seen them too. These 3 bombers had detached from the main attack, positioning themselves for a difficult angle that would be hard to defend. They were coming in at wave-top height, trying to stay below the ship's main gun arcs. "All starboard batteries, target those low flyers," he commanded. The 40mm and 20mm guns depressed, their crews tracking the approaching bombers. Chen swung his mount around, his loader already feeding fresh magazines into the weapon. The bombers grew larger in his sights, close enough now that he could make out individual details. The fixed landing gear, the glint of the canopy, the torpedo slung beneath each fuselage. He pressed the trigger and held it, pouring fire into the lead bomber. The other guns joined in, creating a web of tracers that the bombers had to fly through. The lead Kate shuddered under the hits, its left wing catching fire, but the pilot held his course. At the last moment, the torpedo dropped away, splashing into the water and running true. The bomber, mission complete, nosed up slightly and then cartwheeled into the ocean, disappearing in a splash of foam and debris. The second bomber never made it to release point. A 20mm round found the pilot, and the aircraft nosed down into the waves with full force. The third bomber released its torpedo, but was immediately shredded by concentrated fire from multiple gun positions. "Torpedo, starboard side," came the warning. The Hornet was already turning, but physics and the ocean conspired against her. The torpedo struck amidships, another violent explosion that sent tremors through the entire vessel. This hit was more serious. Lights flickered in the bridge, and the ship's list increased noticeably. Webb's voice came over the intercom again, more strained this time. "Second hit in the engineering spaces. We're taking on water faster than we can pump it out. Requesting all available damage control parties to frames 95 through 102. Mason felt the deck tilting beneath his feet. The Hornet was in serious trouble, but she was still fighting. Around the task force, other ships were engaging the enemy as well, their guns adding to the defensive fire. The sky was a tapestry of tracer rounds, flak bursts, and the smoke trails of falling aircraft. McCarthy executed a hard turn, pursuing a Kate that had just released its torpedo. His guns were nearly empty, but he fired the last of his ammunition in short, controlled bursts. The rounds walked up the bomber's fuselage and into the cockpit area. The Kate wavered, then rolled over and dove into the ocean. "Wildcat flight, this is Hornet Tower," the radio crackled. "We count 21 enemy bombers destroyed. The attack is breaking off. Return to base for rearm and refuel." 21. Out of a force of over 60, the combined efforts of the fighters and ship's defenses had destroyed 21 Kate bombers. It was a staggering achievement, a testament to the skill and courage of the American forces. But it had come at a cost. As McCarthy circled back toward the task force, he could see the Hornet listing in the water, smoke rising from her wounds. Other ships were moving to assist, destroyers coming alongside to help fight fires and provide additional pumping capacity. The carrier was badly hurt, but she was still afloat, still fighting. The young pilot felt a complex mixture of emotions as he set up for landing. Pride in what they had accomplished. Grief for the men who had fallen, both American and Japanese. And underneath it all, the bone-deep weariness that came from combat, from staring death in the face and somehow surviving. On the bridge, Captain Mason was coordinating the damage control effort while simultaneously maintaining tactical awareness of the overall situation. The Japanese might send another strike force. His ship needed to remain ready despite her injuries. "Sir, engineering reports they can maintain 12 knots, Harrison reported. "But we're down to 40% pumping capacity. If we take another hit in the wrong place..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood the precarious nature of their situation. The Hornet had survived through a combination of skill, courage, and luck. The question was whether that luck would hold. Below decks, the damage control teams worked in conditions that would have broken lesser men. Water surged through ruptured compartments. The smell of fuel oil mixed with smoke and the metallic tang of blood where sailors had been caught by the torpedo blasts. Lieutenant Webb moved through the chaos, directing his teams, shoring up bulkheads, fighting to save the ship. Petty Officer Chen had left his gun mount to join the damage control effort. Despite his exhaustion, despite the burns on his hands from the hot gun barrel, he threw himself into the work. Around him, sailors of every background, farm boys from the Midwest, city kids from the coasts, immigrants and native-born Americans, worked side by side. In that moment, all the divisions that plagued society ashore seemed meaningless. They were sailors, brothers in arms, fighting to save their ship. The afternoon wore on. The task force maintained its course, destroyer escorts screening vigilantly for submarines, while the Hornet's crew fought to stabilize their wounded carrier. Above, combat air patrols circled endlessly, ready to intercept any follow-up attacks. McCarthy had landed safely, along with most of his squadron. 2 pilots hadn't made it back. Miller was among the survivors, his Wildcat riddled with bullet holes but still flying. As they climbed down from their aircraft, the 2 young men exchanged a look that said everything words could not. They had been to the edge and back. In the ready room, the surviving pilots gathered for debriefing. Lieutenant Commander Thompson, the squadron leader, stood before them, his face showing the strain of the day's combat. "Gentlemen, what you accomplished today will be studied at the Naval Academy for years to come. Against overwhelming odds, you and the ship's gunners destroyed 21 enemy bombers. That's one of the highest kill ratios recorded in this war." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But we lost good men today. Anderson and Cruz didn't make it back. The Hornet took serious damage. This victory came at a price, and we honor that price by remembering what we're fighting for." McCarthy listened, thinking about the bombers he'd destroyed, about the men inside them who had also been young, who had also believed in their cause. War was like that, brutal and tragic, demanding everything while offering no guarantees. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the Hornet continued to fight for survival. The damage control teams had managed to slow the flooding, and the list had been partially corrected through counter-flooding. The ship was far from combat ready, but she was afloat, and that was something. On the bridge, Captain Mason stood alone for a moment, looking out over his wounded command. The decision facing him was one no captain wanted to make. Should they attempt to return to port for repairs, a journey that would take days through enemy-controlled waters? Or should they abandon ship while they still had time, saving the crew but losing the carrier? Commander Harrison approached, sensing his captain's dilemma. "Sir, the men are asking what comes next." Mason turned to face his executive officer. "What comes next is that we save the ship. The Hornet has been with us through too much to give up on her now. We limp home if we have to, but we're taking her home." The decision made, orders went out. The task force would make for the nearest friendly port, with the Hornet in the center of a protective screen. Every available escort would be utilized, every precaution taken. It would be a race against time and the enemy. As night fell over the Pacific, the wounded carrier maintained her course. On her decks and in her compartments, exhausted sailors continued their work. Some manned their guns, ready for another attack. Others worked in damage control, fighting the ongoing battle against flooding and fire. Still others simply collapsed where they stood, grabbing a few minutes of sleep before the next crisis demanded their attention. McCarthy sat on the flight deck, his back against his fighter's wheel strut. The tropical stars blazed overhead, brilliant and indifferent to human conflict. He thought about home, about the cornfields of Iowa and a life that seemed impossibly distant now. He thought about the day's combat, playing it over in his mind, analyzing his decisions, and wondering what he could have done differently. Miller joined him, sliding down to sit beside his friend. For a long while, neither spoke. They simply sat together, 2 young men far from home, bound by the shared experience of combat. "You think she'll make it?" Miller finally asked, nodding toward the carrier beneath them. McCarthy looked out at the dark water, at the destroyer escorts maintaining their vigilant patrol. "She has to. We all have to." It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of conviction. They had come too far, fought too hard, lost too much to fail now. In the days that followed, the Hornet's journey became an epic of survival. The Japanese did send follow-up attacks, but each was met with fierce resistance. The carrier's fighters, operating from her damaged flight deck, continued to intercept enemy bombers. The ship's guns continued to fire, and below decks, the damage control teams continued their Sisyphean struggle against the ocean. Lieutenant Webb worked himself to exhaustion, then pushed beyond it. His teams rotated in shifts, but he remained at his post, coordinating, directing, improvising solutions to problems no textbook had prepared them for. When one pumping system failed, they rigged another. When a bulkhead threatened to collapse, they shored it up with whatever materials they could find. Chen and his fellow sailors performed miracles of endurance. They worked in flooded compartments, in pitch darkness when the power failed, in heat that turned the lower decks into infernos. They worked through fear and fatigue because their shipmates' lives depended on it, because the ship needed them, because it was their duty and their honor. The task force's destroyers played their own crucial role. These smaller vessels darted around the wounded carrier like protective wolves, their sonar pinging constantly for submarines, their guns ready to engage any air threat. The USS Russell moved alongside at one point, passing over additional pumping equipment and fresh damage control supplies. The camaraderie between ships, the willingness of sailors to risk their own vessels to save another, exemplified the best traditions of the United States Navy. On the morning of the 3rd day, land was sighted. The New Hebrides Islands appeared on the horizon, and with them the promise of safety. But even as relief swept through the crew, they remained vigilant. These final miles were often the most dangerous, as the enemy would make a last desperate attempt to finish off a wounded target. Captain Mason had remained on the bridge almost continuously, catching only brief moments of rest in his sea cabin. His uniform was rumpled, his face drawn with fatigue, but his resolve never wavered. He had made a promise to bring his ship home, and he intended to keep it. "Sir, we have fighter cover from Espiritu Santo," reported Lieutenant Harris, a rare smile crossing his face. 6 F-4Fs inbound to provide escort for the final approach. Mason allowed himself a small nod of satisfaction. They were going to make it. The Hornet entered port under her own power, escorted by her faithful destroyers and the land-based fighters. On her flight deck, her crew stood at quarters, their uniforms torn and stained, their faces showing the marks of battle, but standing tall with pride. They had brought their ship through hell, and she was still afloat. As lines were secured and the ship finally came to rest at the dock, a cheer went up from the crew. It started small, just a few voices, but quickly built into a roar of triumph and relief. 3,000 men celebrating survival, celebrating each other, celebrating the ship that had carried them through. McCarthy stood with his squadron mates, joining in the cheer. Beside him, Miller had tears streaming down his face, and the young pilot from Iowa didn't blame him. They had earned those tears, had earned the right to feel everything, the joy, the grief, the overwhelming sense of having survived something that should have killed them. Captain Mason stood on the bridge wing, looking down at his crew. These men, these ordinary sailors who had performed extraordinary acts of courage, had saved their ship through sheer determination. The 21 Kate bombers they had destroyed represented more than a tactical victory. They represented the indomitable will of free men fighting for a cause they believed in. In the weeks that followed, as the Hornet underwent repairs and her crew recovered from their ordeal, the story of that October day spread through the Pacific Fleet. The suicidal maneuver, maintaining position and fighting rather than attempting to flee, had seemed like madness to some. But Captain Mason had understood a fundamental truth. Sometimes the only way to survive is to stand and fight with everything you have. The after-action reports documented the battle in dry military prose. Enemy aircraft destroyed, damage sustained, casualties suffered. But they couldn't capture the human reality, the fear conquered, the courage displayed, the bonds forged in combat that would last a lifetime. Lieutenant Webb received a commendation for his damage control work, though he deflected all credit to his teams. Petty Officer Chen earned a promotion and the respect of every man aboard, his contribution to saving the ship making a mockery of any prejudice. McCarthy and Miller and the other fighter pilots were recognized for their skill and bravery, though they insisted they had simply done their duty. And the Hornet? She would fight again, her repairs completed, her crew reinforced with new sailors who had to learn the ship's unique character and proud history. The scars from that October battle remained, carefully documented but patched and strengthened. They were badges of honor, reminders of the day when a wounded carrier and her crew had faced overwhelming odds and prevailed. Years later, long after the war had ended, McCarthy would return to Iowa. He would marry, raise children, live the quiet life of a Midwestern farmer. But sometimes, on clear nights when the stars blazed as brilliantly as they had over the Pacific, he would remember. He would remember the roar of the Wildcat's engine, the sight of enemy bombers filling the sky, the feeling of absolute clarity that comes only in combat when there's no time for doubt or fear. He would remember his shipmates, both those who came home and those who didn't. He would remember the Hornet, the ship that had carried them through the firestorm and brought them safely to port. And he would remember the lesson they had all learned in those minutes of chaos, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That ordinary people can do extraordinary things when tested, that the bonds formed in battle transcend all other divisions. The Battle of October 26, 1942, became a case study at the Naval Academy, analyzed and discussed by future generations of officers. They studied the tactics, the gunnery solutions, the damage control procedures, but what couldn't be taught, what couldn't be captured in any manual or lecture, was the spirit of the men who fought that day. That spirit was something each generation had to discover for themselves in their own trials, in their own moments of testing. It was the spirit that had built the Navy, that had carried it through every war, that would sustain it in conflicts yet to come. As the decades passed and the veterans of the Pacific War grew fewer, the story of the Hornet and her incredible defense against the Kate bombers remained. It was told and retold, each retelling adding new details or emphasis, but the core truth remained unchanged. On that October day, surrounded by enemies and fighting for survival, a carrier and her crew had achieved something remarkable. 21 enemy bombers destroyed, a ship saved against all odds. Courage demonstrated not in grand gestures, but in countless small acts. The gunner who stayed at his post despite wounds, the pilot who made one more pass despite empty guns, the sailor in the flooded compartment who kept pumping even as water rose around him. These were the real heroes, the ordinary men who became extraordinary when circumstances demanded it. They didn't think of themselves as heroes. They were simply doing their jobs, helping their shipmates, trying to survive and complete their mission. But in doing so, they wrote a chapter of naval history that would inspire generations to come. The Pacific is vast and deep, and it keeps its secrets well. The bombers that fell that day rest somewhere in its depths, along with their brave crews. The Hornet eventually met her own end in later battles, giving her last full measure to the cause of victory. But the legacy of that October battle lives on, preserved in official records and personal memoirs, in the stories passed down through families, in the lessons taught at the academy. It lives on as a reminder that the outcome of battle is never predetermined, that courage and skill can overcome superior numbers, that a ship is more than steel and machinery. It's the men who serve aboard her, their determination, their willingness to sacrifice, their refusal to surrender even when surrender might seem the rational choice. Commander Harrison would later write in his personal journal about that day, his words capturing something essential about the experience. We did not win because we were unafraid. We won because when fear came, we met it with action. We won because every man aboard, from the captain to the lowest seaman, understood that we were stronger together than any force arrayed against us. We won because giving up was simply not an option we could consider. That refusal to consider defeat, that absolute commitment to mission and shipmates, defined the greatest generation of naval warriors. They faced an enemy that was skilled, determined, and willing to die for victory. And they met that enemy not with hate, but with professional competence and unshakable resolve. The battle lasted hours, but its impact echoed through years. Veterans who had served aboard the Hornet would meet decades later at reunions, old men now, gathering to remember youth and war and shipmates long gone. They would share stories, some funny, some tragic, all bound together by the shared experience that had shaped their lives. They would talk about Captain Mason's steady leadership, about Lieutenant Webb's tireless work below decks, about the pilots who had flown until their guns ran dry and then kept flying anyway. They would remember the sounds, the roar of guns, the scream of diving bombers, the explosion of torpedoes striking home. They would remember the smells, cordite and aviation fuel, salt spray and smoke. And they would remember the feeling of being part of something larger than themselves, of being aboard a ship that had earned her place in history. As the sun set on those reunions, as the old sailors said their goodbyes, there was always an unspoken understanding between them. They had been tested in the furnace of war and had not been found wanting. They had served with honor, had done their duty, had kept faith with their shipmates and their country. Whatever else their lives had brought, whatever successes or failures they had known in the decades since, they would always have that. They would always be Hornet men, veterans of the day when their ship had faced destruction and had fought her way through to survival. The story of the Hornet's defense against the Kate bombers is more than just a tale of naval combat. It's a story about human capacity, our ability to face overwhelming odds, to push beyond what we think are our limits, to find strength in unity and purpose. It's a story about leadership at every level, from the captain making strategic decisions to the gunner choosing to stay at his post. It's a story about the price of freedom and the courage required to defend it. In the final analysis, the significance of those minutes of chaos, when 21 enemy bombers fell from the sky and a wounded carrier refused to die, transcends the tactical and strategic. It speaks to something fundamental about the human spirit, about our capacity for heroism when circumstances demand it, about the bonds that form between people who face death together and emerge on the other side. The young sailors who fought that day, McCarthy and Miller, Chen and Webb, and hundreds of others whose names have faded from history, did not set out to become heroes. They were simply young men caught up in a global conflict, trying to do their duty and survive. But in the crucible of combat, they discovered reserves of courage they hadn't known they possessed. They discovered that they were capable of more than they had imagined. And perhaps that's the ultimate lesson of the Hornet's battle, that greatness isn't something we're born with, but something we discover in ourselves when tested. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That the difference between victory and defeat often comes down to the willingness to keep fighting when every rational calculation says you should quit. The Pacific War would rage for 3 more years after that October day. Many more battles would be fought, many more ships damaged or lost, many more lives sacrificed on the altar of victory. But the men who served aboard the Hornet during those minutes of chaos carried with them a knowledge that sustained them through all that followed. They had been tested under the most extreme circumstances imaginable and had proven themselves equal to the challenge. As we remember their story today, from the comfortable distance of decades, it's important to understand that these were not supermen or mythical heroes. They were ordinary people, farmers' sons and city kids, mechanics and poets, athletes and scholars, who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and rose to meet them. Their legacy is not just the tactical victory they achieved or the strategic impact of saving a carrier, but the example they set for all who would come after. In every generation, there are moments that test us, that demand we choose between comfort and duty, between safety and honor, between surrender and struggle. The men of the Hornet faced such a moment on October 26, 1942. Their choice to stand and fight, to refuse defeat, to trust in each other and their training made all the difference. The waves that day lapped against the Hornet's hull continue their endless rhythm across the Pacific. The sky that witnessed such violence has seen countless peaceful sunsets since. But the memory of what happened remains, preserved not just in history books and official records, but in the living legacy of the values those sailors defended: courage, honor, sacrifice, and an unshakable commitment to freedom. This is why we remember. This is why we tell their story. Not to glorify war, which is always tragic and terrible, but to honor those who, when called upon, gave everything they had in defense of the ideals we still cherish. The minutes of chaos that saw 21 enemy bombers destroyed were also minutes that revealed the best of what humanity can be when facing its darkest challenges. The USS Hornet's suicidal maneuver wasn't suicidal at all. It was calculated courage, professional competence, and absolute determination combined in perfect measure. It was leadership that inspired, rather than commanded, teamwork that transcended individual limitations, and a refusal to accept defeat that transformed a desperate defensive battle into a stunning tactical victory. And in the end, that's what makes their story not just memorable, but timeless, a reminder that the human spirit, when properly motivated and led, is capable of achieving what seems impossible, of prevailing against overwhelming odds, of turning the tide of battle through sheer determination and courage. The men of the Hornet proved that on October 26, 1942, and their legacy continues to inspire all who hear their story.